On this week's program, we're going to talk about how to have a conversation with your kids about money. A bit of a sort of a taboo subject, if you will, or I guess one that might cause people to be awkward, but at the end of the day, it's an important one to have for a couple of different reasons that we're going to be going into on this week's program. Plus, we will give you some suggestions as well on how you can tackle said taboo subject about talking with your kids about money. And then we're going to also be chatting about the survivor's penalty that always applies when you lose a partner. And at the end of the day, if losing a spouse isn't tough enough, how about having to deal with less income and higher taxes on top of that? Sadly, that is a situation that many folks find themselves in, because it's a very real situation when we start to think about couples. And the harsh reality is that it's pretty unlikely that both of you are going to pass at the same time. So there will be a window of time where there is just one instead of two. And that has both income and tax implications in a major way. So we're going to break all of that down on this week's episode of Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. We're one of Central Florida's longest running radio programs, coming to you on a host of the stations along with a massive variety of podcast channels. Any trouble finding us, go to our website at Nelson Financial Planning. There, you'll see a bunch of icons. You can click on them. They will instantly connect you. Once you have gotten connected, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And then that way, you'll get instantly informed whenever we put new content out there. My name is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of folks who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries, along with experts in various parts of the financial world. They stand ready, willing, and more than capable to help you improve your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So speaking of the team of certified financial fiduciaries, last week on the program, Rob Field, Christina Lamb hosted this show. And so we want to start out, first of all, by thanking them for doing that. And if you missed the show, you missed a good show. Very creative. I think the combination, when Rob and Christina do the show together, they really do try and put a bit of a creative spin on it. And in their latest foray last week, they came up with an acronym for the word saving. So if you missed the show, make sure you check it out on our podcast channels. Here's a quick recap, and I'm just going to share the broad strokes. So you think of the word savings, right? S-A-V-I-N-G-S. They came up with a very nice acronym that really helps to drive the point home about savings. The S, of course, stands for stay the course. A stands for automate your contributions. V stands for valuing discipline. I stands for invest wisely. N stands for nurturing positive habits. G stands for guarding against risk. And S stands for stop spending. Stop spending. Obviously, pretty good strategy in terms of increasing your savings. So a pretty neat way to think of that whole concept of savings. Again, we encourage you to listen to last week's show on those podcast platforms or on our YouTube channel. Rob and Christina, we thank them very much. And just a very creative, interesting way of addressing the topic of savings. And speaking of that S part in savings, as they described it in the acronym, the S part, of course, is staying the course. Markets have certainly been demonstrating that once again over the course of the past couple of months. Hard to believe that on April 8th, okay, so the original air date of this program, June 8th. So April 8th, exactly 2 months prior, the S&P 500 on April the 8th was down over 15% year to date, 15.3 to be exact. But it completely reversed that decline in the subsequent 5 weeks, very much sort of a V-shaped rally where the markets went up by over 18%. Interestingly, the last time that the S&P 500 erased a 15% year-to-date decline in less than 6 weeks was all the way back in September of 1982, over 40 plus years ago. So great reason to say, well, that S part of saving, staying the course certainly makes sense. And just in the past 2 months, the markets have certainly borne that out. Because I'm thinking if you were looking at the headlines on April the 8th, you probably found it hard to see anything positive that was going to happen that would lead to that quick of a reversal. But lo and behold, that is what happened. On an earlier program this year, and I think it was in late March, probably around the time of that sort of that leading edge of that V-shaped performance that the market has done or did in the second quarter of this year, we talked about volatility and explained that it's measured by the CBOE volatility index, or as it's popularly known as the VIX. At the time, the VIX was striking a record high. Again, sort of that same early April time period. The VIX closed above 60 and stayed above 40 until about April the 10th. In the ensuing 21 trading days, the VIX continued to drop, eventually winding up below sort of a floor of 20 on May 12th. Now, don't get hung up on those numbers and those dates. The reality, and the biggest point to that, is that was the fastest ever decline from above 40 to below 20 in the history of the VIX, going back to its inception in 1990. So volatility came and went, I guess in this case, just as fast. Talk about a great example of why you have to follow the S in the acronym savings that Rob and Christina talked about last week. Certainly after a rough April, the markets in the month of May had their best month since November of 2023. And obviously what's interesting about sort of that shift in sentiment over the course of the past 2 months, whether you're looking at the markets, whether you're looking at the volatility index, pretty dramatic shift just in this past 2 months. Beyond the obvious headlines that spurred it, and clearly the decision by the current administration to ultimately sort of pause on the tariffs, no doubt was a significant driver of that. But something else was afoot that didn't get much attention. We wanted to talk a little bit about it in the program this week because along the way, it sort of got forgotten that during that same time period, right, that April-May time period, the reality is that it was, in fact, corporate earnings season for the first quarter of the year. And so let's not forget about the importance of corporate earnings, right? Set the headlines aside for a minute. And let's face it, market performance is impacted just as much as by company earnings, right? I mean, that should make sense. If the market is basically a valuation mechanism for companies, right? And then one of the biggest factors about what's going to drive that valuation ultimately over time is whether if said company is actually making money or not, right? I mean, that would make sense. So if you're making money, then more often than not, the market rewards that and drives up the price of that particular company stock, right? If you got good earnings, then so too does the value of your stock price go up. And then if a lot of companies are all making good money, then the overall market is going to experience an upswing. Well, here's the stats of the corporate earnings perspective behind what was going on over the course of the past couple of months. Profits from companies in the S&P 500 rose 13% in the first quarter of 2025 from a year ago. 13%, that's kind of a big number. What's even more important about that number is that when at the end of March, analysts, all the experts, if you will, on Wall Street expected roughly about 7% earnings growth. So in essence, corporate America managed to, as a whole, generate about double in terms of earnings growth than what was expected going into earnings season. So you don't have to be rocket science to say, well, that probably is going to move the market. And just another example of how hard it is, even for the experts, to predict what's going on, because certainly their predictions in March were way off in terms of what happened in corporate earnings season. We're going to take a break and continue here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. Let's get into this. One of the most taboo subjects out there, and this transcends socioeconomic status. So it doesn't matter whether you got a ton of money or not really all that much money. Sort of regardless of your financial status, the notion of talking to your kids about money is often a tricky subject and certainly has some taboo with it, if you will. And we see it all the time at the office at Nelson Financial Planning. It takes many forms. Sometimes it takes the form of the next generation simply not being aware of the existence of certain accounts, to the next generation being sort of ill-equipped to handle their own finances, let alone a potential inheritance. I suppose that's one of the many reasons why we wrote the book Next Gen Dollars and Cents, a bit of a guidebook on all things financial, ranging from taxes to saving to retirement. If you follow us on YouTube, we're holding up a copy of the book now on our YouTube channel. That book is, as always, available free anytime you schedule that initial conversation at our office at Nelson Financial Planning. So make sure you go to our website and do that right now at nelsonfinancialplanning.com. So talking about those challenges that people face when talking about money and to their kids. And we want to give you some concrete suggestions about how to maybe break that taboo and provide a better insight into money and finances in general. And there are two sort of primary reasons why you want to engage in this conversation about money with your kids. First is sort of the obvious one. It's not really, finances is not really an integral part, unfortunately, of what is taught in the school system these days. So you have an opportunity when you engage in that conversation with your kids about money to teach them and help to put them on a path towards self-sufficiency, responsible stewardship of money. And we all hear the stories, and certainly we've heard plenty over the years at Nelson Financial Planning of how ill-prepared and how bad the decisions can be by folks making bad choices about their money, right? Whether it's racking up credit card debt or going off on sort of ill-timed adventures. I remember one particular situation when an individual inherited some money, thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and quit their high-paying job that also had a pension with it, and they decided to start a franchise. And don't get me wrong, it's fine to start a business, but if you've never run a business, then maybe you don't give up your well-paying job and pour hundreds of thousands of dollars of an inheritance into a venture in which you don't really have any experience. Needless to say, the end result of that did not turn out well. So, important considerations on just being able, having the conversation about money with kids really helps to give you an opportunity to help educate them as well. And then the second important reason to engage in this conversation with them is it does help to provide perspective as it relates to the money that they will get from you, right? They're going to get it, or whatever's left over after you're done using it, because, of course, everyone dies. The statistics, though, aren't particularly great. Something like 96% of all inheritances are fully spent in 18 months. Let me say that one again, because it is a pretty shocking statistic. 96% of all inheritances are fully spent within 18 months. That's not good. And if you've got an opportunity to engage in conversation, maybe you can help prevent that. And then similarly, the next generation does need to know where the bodies are buried, if you will, on this, what accounts you have, where those accounts are. Far too often we run into stories about how kids are kind of in the dark and wind up spending a lot of time sort of chasing after accounts or chasing after lost safe deposit boxes. We've got one situation that actually is directly on point with that right now. And because we help our clients engage in these conversations at Nelson Financial Planning, I mean, we really do like those real sort of intergenerational meetings where we sit down with the parents, the kids, and sometimes even the grandkids and talk through things. And because of that, we don't see these issues quite as much, perhaps, as in general society. But the power of those types of conversations, I suppose, is one of the biggest roles that we at Nelson Financial Planning serve in terms of being able to sit down and have those conversations with our clients. So wanted to give you some tips that against this backdrop of sort of why it's important to help kids understand about money, certainly not anything that they're learning, and then important to provide perspective. We've got 3 tips that we're going to go over in this segment now about how to sort of broach this subject. And I guess the first is the obvious, to clear the air, if you will. Acknowledge that talking about money is going to be a tricky conversation, and you want to engage with your kids in this discussion openly and honestly. And this provides them and you the opportunity to, sort of express concerns, ask questions that you might otherwise not really be comfortable asking. So that's number 1. Number 2 is to seek out good educational information. Here the internet can be both your friend and your foe. The internet is obviously a great starting point to learn about issues, but financial issues, for the most part, require much more in-depth analysis and discussion than just a 30-second video or, a 4-sentence summary courtesy of AI. Shameless plug for our book, I suppose, Next Gen Dollars and Cents. Many of our clients have shared this valuable resource with their kids, and the feedback has been overwhelming in terms of folks that find it as a good resource. So much, in fact, that later this year, we're going to be publishing a companion workbook to our book, Next Gen Dollars and Cents. Give it to have that workbook run in parallel with our book, to give folks the opportunity to work through some specific exercises to really help them understand and get a better handle on what their finances will be. So stay tuned, obviously, for that. It means that I actually need to get going on creating the workbook. Number 3 is I've started. I wouldn't have said it on the radio if I hadn't started quite. So anyway, number 3, clarify expectations, right? Maybe there are things that you want your money used for when you are gone, and things that you don't want it used for. Maybe you want them to use it to pay off the debt rather than go on a vacation. And then I suppose if you really want to put some guidelines on that money that the next generation is going to inherit, then that's where you would consider using a trust. I think that the simplest way to describe that, or where that would come into play, is at the end of the day, we like to, when we're describing a trust to clients, we like to use the expression of, you need a trust when you don't trust your kids. That's the point of the trust, is to schedule out and to framework out some guidelines in terms of the future use of that money. So obviously these are good conversations to have. Stephanie and I have had these on a personal basis with our 3 boys, sort of talking about finances, talking about good stewardship of money, charitable giving, and those kinds of things. Certainly a real opportunity to teach and to share and to provide insight. And hopefully that has given us the opportunity to provide some perspective about money, whether that be charitable giving, to, trying to live below your means, and ultimately use that to achieve financial independence over their lifetimes. That's why I like getting the calls like I did this past week from Nelson, complaining about the cost of his car repair bill. And I'm like, well, a couple $100 is not that bad, bud. So, anyway, we hope you've had the opportunity to have this conversation with your kids. Obviously, at Nelson Financial Planning, we're here to help with that, from resources like our book, Next Gen Dollars and Cents, to spending time meeting with you and your next generation to talk through all of this. Make sure you take an opportunity to really have that conversation with your kids. With that, we're going to take a break here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. This is a toughie. We're talking about a tough subject, right? Prior segment, we were talking about trying to address sort of the taboo topic of talking with your kids about money. In this segment, we're going to talk about a much tougher situation of losing your partner. And for many, that's either a current reality or a future reality, depending upon where you're at. Beyond the grieving process, right, that you're hit with, there's a multi-part financial burden that comes as well, a sort of a survivor's penalty, if you will. And on this segment, we're going to talk about exactly what form that penalty takes and how you might better prepare for it. So this is a real issue, right? I mean, we all know the stats. It's highly unlikely that you and your partner, your spouse, are going to die at the same time, right? I mean, you know, you're going to die at the same time if it's like a horrific car accident. But beyond that, chances are, you know, you're going to be dying at different points in time. And of course, the reality is that women live longer than men, right? According to the CDC, for the most recent population data that was released in December of 2023, there's roughly a 5.3-year difference in the life expectancy between the sexes. If you didn't know which one lives longer, the answer is women. The survivor penalty for that surviving spouse takes two forms here. One is obvious, and the other is not so obvious, at least initially. The obvious one, of course, is the loss of income. That is immediate. That's pretty straightforward, and certainly has an immediate impact. At the very least, if both of you are collecting Social Security, right, one of the Social Security checks is going to go away. Usually it's, of course, the smaller one that disappears using the widow's benefit under Social Security, because you're allowed to retain the larger amount and then the smaller one goes away. But that happens instantaneously. Like the next month, they're not going to send all of the Social Security. So that's the obvious one, the change in income. The not so obvious survivor penalty has to deal with taxes, which, when you lose a spouse, will be going up. Now, that's not something you'll see immediately, right? Because when it's two people on a tax return, you get a larger standard deduction, wider tax brackets than when it's just one person on it, right? For example, in 2025, the standard deduction is $30,000 for married couples, $15,000 for singles. So literally, you know, it's like a doubling in terms of some of the deductions, and in terms of the breadth of the income tax brackets, those get cut in half when you go from married to single. That should make sense, right? Two people versus one. The reality of the tax hike, though, that happens when a spouse passes away is that it has a very delayed response on your finances. Because, see, in the year in which your partner dies, you get to continue to file taxes on a joint basis. So there's no immediate impact there. But wait another year, and the impact of being a single filer will raise its head. So here's how it works. Let's say your spouse passed away last month, right? May of 2025. For the taxes that you then file in April of 2026, which would be the 2025 tax return, because your spouse lived in the year 2025, then you're able to file a joint return. So nothing really changing on that regard. However, the taxes you file for 2026, which you don't file until April of 2027, basically almost 2 years from now, well, that's when the shift to single rates will, in fact, have an impact on your finances. So that's a delayed reaction. That's a delayed response, right? Stop and think about that, if you will. In that particular example, I lost my spouse last month. I'm not going to see the real impact on my taxes for almost a 2-year period of time. And that can certainly be pretty significant, right? So how do you beat this, right? We got an obvious issue in terms of the loss of income. We got a less than obvious issue in terms of the taxes and how much those are going to go up. So it really requires, in order to properly address this, it really requires sort of planning in two parts, if you will. First, obviously some income planning, and then you might be doing some multi-year tax planning as well. The income planning obviously tackles the first issue with the survivor penalty, the loss of income. That income planning part kind of has to be done immediately. That has to be done now. Death is always unexpected. If you don't plan ahead on this part, well, then that impact of less income is going to be immediate. You don't get extra time to sort of plan for that. And at the end of the day, that income planning then requires running a variety of what-if scenarios to see where you might be able to make that income up in terms of generating that additional income that's needed to ultimately offset that loss of income that happens when a partner passes. Now, it doesn't have to be the exact same amount, right? Because after all, your partner probably was costing some money, whether it's healthcare, prescriptions, hobbies, things like that. But certainly some of it needs to be accounted for and analyzed, and in particular discussed ahead of time. That is for sure. I mean, these are the types of conversations that we have every day with our clients at Nelson Financial Planning, kind of going through these different scenarios. And I suppose you could go online and run an online scenario or do a spreadsheet, but I think there's no substitute for the power of a conversation that allows people to talk things through and helps to reveal things that, you might not necessarily have thought of. Now, don't get me wrong, spreadsheet's a great starting point, okay, but many times when we're having these conversations with clients at Nelson Financial Planning, we realize that, well, there's a spreadsheet that's been run, and that's great. That's a great starting point, but maybe there's a missing assumption or an improper assumption or just some simply wrong calculations or forgotten calculations. So important to kind of really work through that income planning. Now, the second part of the deal in terms of how to deal with the survivor penalty, it might not be quite as time sensitive as the first, right? The income loss is going to be immediate, right? Next month, hey, the income it's stopping because that's immediate. But the other part is just as important because that requires a little bit of sort of multi-year perspective, particularly on the tax planning part, because that shift from married to single bracket certainly has a pretty big income. And as we were talking about in the example we gave earlier in this segment, where it can be a delay of nearly 2 years. So this analysis, when you're talking about multi-year tax planning, I mean, that's a little bit more than a spreadsheet. It requires some real sort of tax return software. And I suppose that's one of the things that makes us unique at Nelson Financial Planning is that our range of services actually includes doing actual tax returns. And so that tax impact of losing a spouse is not just delayed, right? I mean, it's delayed, but it's also permanent. So so going forward, you will be filing single, and that leads to the potentially, of course, higher taxes, but also potential for other things like increased Medicare premiums and all of that, because the income threshold that triggers that is then cut in half as well. So obviously doing some multi-year tax planning then helps to provide some guidance on those potential tax savings, right? Maybe generating additional income in the year that the spouse passes when you're still in those married brackets. Maybe that's a valuable strategy to pursue. Maybe it is delaying your charitable contributions or your qualified charitable distributions to the following year when you'll have to deal with being on those single brackets. Those are just some of the kinds of strategies that sort of will only become apparent once you kind of actually run the tax return projection, if you will. So a spreadsheet won't necessarily suffice there. You really need that in-depth tax return analysis. So just be aware, beyond the loss of income that happens when you lose a spouse, there is also an increase in taxes as well, both of which need to be planned for ahead of time. With that, we're going to take a break here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. one of them, lesser amount, is going away. The other financial impact is delayed. Sometimes, as we were talking in the prior segment, for as much as 2 years. Clearly, though, taxes have a major impact on your finances, right? And so the income impact of the survivor's penalty when a partner passes away, that one has to be dealt with ahead of time, right? You don't want your spouse to pass and then be like, oh man, a week later you got to go run out and get a job because you didn't think through the fact that the income was going to change when they pass. It reminds me of an email that I got just this past week from a longtime client asking about, well, what happens when my husband passes? And in this case, he has a pension, and so that pension would get significantly reduced. And the other part of the reality is that he is 10 years older, so certainly a conversation worth having. And in this case, we had planned and discussed that potential issue years ago, and so it was an easy response to her email where we kind of said, well, you know, we planned for that. We planned for that eventuality. Given that he's also 10 years older, the reality is that well over a decade, maybe even longer ago than that, probably might even be 12 or 13 years ago, we had him purchase a life insurance policy, and ultimately the notion was, well, when he passes, this life insurance policy is going to get paid off, is going to pay out, and then you're going to have a chunk of money, and that's all tax-free money versus his pension, which is taxable, and using his required minimum distribution to help make the premiums each and every year, and that's good because the required minimum distribution for an individual will typically go up a little bit every year as they get older, and in theory the balance kind of trends upward as well, and so that helps to offset the increasing costs that the cost of insurance that typically would apply on an insurance policy. So just a great example of why when you're thinking about the survivor penalty and what happens financially, the income planning piece, you want to plan ahead on that one. Planning ahead on that one is certainly pretty crucial. You certainly don't want to be running around trying to find a job the week after your partner passes because you didn't plan ahead on that. The tax implication, meanwhile, on that the tax implication piece of the sort of the survivor penalty, that takes on a little bit of a different format, sort of a delayed format, as we were talking about in that prior segment. And in order to address that, you've got to really think through multiple years of tax returns, because the year which they pass, you're going to get to continue to file a joint return. So the following April of that year, okay, great, it's a joint return, no big change there. But then it's the next April where all of a sudden you go from joint tax rates and tax tables to single. Obviously, that changes the tax picture pretty dramatically. And so what you then need to be doing to make sure that you are prepared for that is change things like your tax withholding to make sure that it's going to be enough. And certainly important to not just sort of speculate on what that may or may not be, but it's important to kind of run an actual tax return in order to get a handle on what the exact impact will be, because it'll be a pretty significant impact. You go from 2 people to 1, all of your income tax brackets get cut in half in terms of the range, and then things like your standard deduction and things like that also get cut in half as well. So one of the biggest reasons why at Nelson Financial Planning we do have a tax preparation service. Now almost 25 years ago we started that. Hard to believe. I remember when we did that. It's kind of crazy how time flies, and kind of crazy how different it is, right? Back in those days, everything was done sort of by hand and by paper. And I remember the stacks and stacks and stacks of paper that would be around the office at tax time. Now, of course, it's all, in some magical cloud somewhere. But at least we're not killing as many trees. So that's good. Also on the program, we tackled the taboo subject of talking about money with the next generation. And to recap that a little bit, there are a couple of good reasons why you should do that. First, obviously, is to help educate your kids and that next generation about finances in general, right? So often people just aren't getting that baseline education when it comes to how best to handle money on a regular basis. And then the second of all is to provide some perspective, right, on your money. You don't want to have to chase things around or kind of like engage in some Easter egg hunt looking for different accounts all over the place. It's certainly important to prepare. We see that sort of all too often, whether it's poor decisions about money that the next generation makes, or just simply trying to figure out where assets are and whether they exist or not. So important to have good information and keep it up to date. One of our best recommendations on that is to have a document that you maintain that has all of those details, account numbers, phone numbers, addresses, all of that in one location on one document, so the next generation doesn't have to engage in a Easter egg hunt of epic proportions to be able to find where all of this money is. So important to do that. Don't forget those 3 tips we also talked about to help you engage in this conversation with the next generation. Important to sort of clear the air. We all know it's a tough subject, kind of taboo to talk about money with your kids, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a valuable one where you can give it the opportunity to have them ask questions and to get perspective. Number 2, certainly to seek out good educational information. A lot of resources out there beyond just our shameless plug for our book, Next Gen Dollars and Cents. The internet's full of stuff. Dave Ramsey obviously has some good information. I mean, hopefully the places to seek that information out. Be careful with the internet, obviously. Oftentimes that's just basic summary type information. You really got to dig a little bit deeper. That's why one of the things that we're going to be doing this year, as the year continues to roll by, is we are going to create a companion workbook that gives folks the opportunity to really work through some exercises to get a better understanding, a better hands-on understanding of their finances. We'll have that companion workbook done probably by the fall or towards the end of the year. That really will go hand in hand with our book, Next Gen Dollars and Cents. So keep an ear and an eye out for that as well. And then lastly, in terms of engaging in the conversation about money with your kids, it's important to sort of clarify expectations, right? What do you want to see happen? If you think that you're not going to be able to clarify expectations enough, well, then that's when a trust comes into play to establish those guardrails. Remember our key expression on that. You need a trust if you don't trust people. That is really the purpose of the trust across the board. So that gets us towards the end of our program for this week. If you think the topics today are important to you and you understand the value of a conversation and putting some actual details into what a plan might be, whether that's a plan to talk with your kids about money, or a plan to account for what happens if your partner passes before you. Certainly, all of those are valuable conversations to work through the survivor penalty and discussing money. Reach out to us, whether it's through our website at nelsonfinancialplanning.com or simply by calling the office at 407-629-6477. When you're on our website, you'll see a host of resources as well, along with various videos about each chapter of our book to help give you better information across the board about a host of financial topics, along with our blog posts as well. So if you've never been to our website at Nelson Financial Planning, why don't you go there and check it out? A lot of good information on there as well. And ultimately, if you'd like to sit down and have a conversation with us, well, that's what the Contact Us box is for, right? Go ahead and fill out your name, pertinent information, and all of that good stuff, and the office will be in touch with you to set up an absolutely free, no obligation conversation with one of the folks here at the team at Nelson Financial Planning. With that, we're going to wrap it on up and get on out of here. This has been Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to Dollars and Cents.